Welcome students of Form 3. Welcome to this video about the topic of social groups, like you can see here. And if you want to grab your book and look the paragraph up in your book, then you can find it in chapter 2 and paragraph 2 being about, you've read it already, social groups. So grab your book and look at what we're talking about right now. Social groups. What do you have to learn during this paragraph and during this video, the learning outcome? Kita e meta pa e capítulo aqui. At the end of this topic, you will have to define and use terms in relation to various social groups, and you have to be able to outline the characteristics of each type of social group. So you have to be able to define and use them in relation to various social groups and have to outline them. So these are the learning outcomes. And what does define mean? Actually, define in papimento unificación da definir. So you have to be able to put a definition to that. For what does it mean? What is it? Yeah, you have to be able to do these things. So these are the learning outcomes of the paragraph that we are looking at right now. You can also find them in chapter 2, paragraph 2 in your textbook, your study guide. Well, to begin with, what is actually a social group? A social group consists out of two or more people who interact frequently. Yeah? Un simang, un luna, mas bianang durante un simang, more times during a week, interact frequently. They share common interests. Yes, so they interact frequently. They share common interests, share a feeling of unity, and then papimento. This is the following. If you translate this saying, this expression, and it's a very important expression in sociology and social studies, is que significa, yeah, the following, sentido de unión or un sentido de unidad. So they feel like being one group, they feel like something of togetherness together. They work towards a common goal was also the last purpose. Anyway, you can look it up in your book. What kind of groups do we have? We have primary and we have secondary groups. Yeah. So families, friendships are examples of primary groups, like you can see here. Friendships, families, and schools, political parties, or trade unions are examples of secondary groups. Political parties or trade unions are examples of secondary groups, like you can see here. And these last two, I can imagine that political parties and trade unions are not something that you are very familiar with. So, political party, think papiamento da Partido Non Politico. And as I'm making this video in March of this year, there will be elections. Yes, and 10 years ago, the political parties of Curacao looked like this, but they don't exist anymore. Yes, and we have also trade unions, Sindicato Non Laboral, in which people with the same job unite and they work together to get better circumstances, payment, insurance, circumstances in which they work each day for their kind of job. For instance, teachers have un sindicato non laboral. People who work with oil have a sindicato non laboral. People who work for the government, and so on. Partido non politico were these 10 years ago, like you can see here. Some of them don't exist anymore, like País, and Sindicato non laboral was very important during the events of 20 May, where the labor unions of Curaçao went on strike with almost 5,000 people walking around the Schottegat with protest signs, organizing a huelga, organizing a strike. So organizing a strike, a huelga, is one way in which Sindicato Non Laboral can get better circumstances and improve their payments, their wages, or um, their securities on the work and also their circumstances in which they work. Yeah. their welfare, their pensions, and so on. And this also happened during the famous, on Curacao anyway, the famous events of 30 May. And these, what I just showed you now, are examples of trade unions, Iniciativa de Papiamento, Sindicato Non Laboral, and political parties, studying Papiamento, or here, Partido Non Politico. Let's continue. We have primary groups and secondary groups, and I won't talk about everything, but about these three parts of it: size, degree of interaction, and relationships. I'll take three samples of them. Size. A primary group has a small size. Yeah? Degree of interaction. To which degree do members of a primary group or a secondary group interact together? Yeah? Interaction is less frequent than in primary group when talking about secondary group. Yeah? Or when talking about the primary group, each member interacts with all others. So have interaction with each part of the group in a primary group, like you could see here actually. Yeah, and relationships, like we can see in a primary group. What can you say about relationships in a primary group? They are personal and intimate, while in a secondary group, they are less personal and can be based on function, on the role you have in the group. So here you see futures of primary groups and secondary groups. Characteristics, you could also say, by which you can recognize what is actually what. Yeah, and I've talked about a few of them, but you have to study them by yourself too to know them all and really to comprehend them. What is the difference between a primary group and a secondary group on the other hand? Did you know there are groups that are both primary and formal, or primary and informal? For instance, your class at school is a primary group, frequent face-to-face contact, but also a formal group because there are, among other things, rules governing behavior. So, for instance, your class at school is both a primary group and a formal group. So it can be both of the characteristics or the categories, better said, categories or kinds of groups at the same time, like for instance, your class at school is at the same time a primary group because of face-to-face contact, but also a formal group because you have rules that organize the behavior and give sanctions when you step off the bounds of that behavior. You can also find this in your book under the cover of Did You Know? Yeah, so you can also look at your book and read this and make sure that you understand what the book is trying to tell you actually. You can find it in blue under the header of Did You Know? So look at it also in your book. Informal and formal groups. So social groups can be classified as formal or informal depending on how they are organized. Schools, Girl Guide groups, and trade unions are examples of formal groups. Yeah? Syndicalistanan, labor unions, trade unions, but also schools, the school where you're now, or Girl Guide groups, they are examples of formal groups. And many such groups help in the socialization of children and young people. And a group of friends within a church, office, or school would be an example of an informal group. So a group of friends within a church, office, or school would be an example of an informal group. So if we talk now for the last 10 minutes about formal and informal groups, we talked about other kinds of groups. We talked about what is a group of two or more people. We talked about political parties. We talked about labor unions. We talked about characteristics of different kinds of groups. There will be a part B of this video, or part 2, but make sure you understand what we did in this video, talking about different kinds of groups, talking about labor unions, talking about political parties, formal, informal groups, characteristics of different kinds of groups, and what a group actually is. And we will continue in part 2 or part B of this video about formal and informal groups. If you want to subscribe, do that below. Then the bell can be rung, the bell will be rung when I make new videos. And you can also ask questions during class or posting a question below the video. Enjoy your evening, afternoon, or morning.